on the morning of May 11th, 1979. In a hotel suite in Los Angeles, a frail woman who had once been called the richest girl in the world died of a heart attack, and when the lawyers tallied what was left of her fortune, the figure came to roughly $3,500. She had inherited a sum worth more than $1 billion in today's money. She owned palaces, an emperor's jade, a Romanov tiara. She married a prince, a count, a baron, a tennis champion, a Hollywood idol, 7 husbands in all, and she died nearly broke, weighing under 80 pounds, attended by almost no one. How does a child inherit one of the great American fortunes and spend 40 years, and almost every dollar of it, trying to buy the one thing money has never once been able to purchase? This is the story of the Woolworths. Her grandfather built an empire out of nickels and dimes, a chain of stores so vast it raised the tallest building on earth, paid for entirely in cash. And he passed down to a little girl named Barbara Hutton a fortune large enough to last 10 lifetimes. She did not make it last one. A founder who proved a poor boy could buy anything he wanted. A mother found dead on a hotel room floor when Barbara was 4 years old. And 7 weddings, each one sold to the public as true love. And each one, in its way, another transaction. Watch this not as the tale of a spoiled heiress. Watch it as the question underneath every fortune. What happens to a child you give everything to, except the thing she actually needs? And remember, a single object. A small bottle of pills on a nightstand, beside a telephone that did not ring. We will come back to it. Begin on a hard-scrabble potato farm in upstate New York, with a boy who is failing at the only life he knows. He was born in 1852. Near Rodman, New York, the son of struggling farmers, into a household where money was a thing you never quite had enough of. He was awkward, shy to the point of pain, and bad at farm work, clumsy with animals, miserable in the fields, dreaming of anything but the dirt. His own family doubted he would amount to much. His name was Frank Winfield Woolworth, and the wound that drove him was simple and lifelong: the fear of being poor, and the deeper fear of being nobody. Picture his first try at the thing he loved, retail. He talked his way into a dry goods store as a clerk, and he was so nervous, so unpolished, that his employer at first refused to let him wait on customers at all. He was deemed not presentable enough to be seen. The boy who would one day raise the tallest building on earth was, at the start, kept in the back, out of sight. But in that store he saw something no one else had built a fortune on yet. A table of odds and ends marked at a single low price, 5 cents, and the way customers swarmed it. Fix, honest, low prices. Goods you could touch yourself instead of asking a clerk. It was a small idea. It would remake American retail. Woolworth's own creed was pure, cold arithmetic. "I am the world's worst salesman," he reportedly admitted. "Therefore I must make it easy for people to buy." He didn't trust charm, he trusted the system. And there is the seed of everything that follows. Frank Woolworth believed, to the marrow, that anything could be obtained if you simply built the right machine and put enough money behind it. Goods, status, even respect. He had a conviction about wealth and what it could purchase, a belief he lived by completely, that his granddaughter would one day test against the human heart and lose. We will return to exactly what he believed. For now, hold the image: a shy, slighted farm boy who decided that money was the answer to being nobody. He was about to prove it on a scale the world had never seen. The rise nearly didn't happen at all. In 1879, Frank Woolworth opened his very first store, a great 5-cent store in Utica, New York. It failed within months. The location was wrong. The town was indifferent. The shy farm boy's one big idea collapsed on its first attempt. Most men would have quit. Woolworth, terrified of poverty, could not afford to. He tried again that same year in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, added a 10-cent line to the nickel goods. And this time the crowds came and did not stop. The 5 and dime was born. From that single surviving store, he built an empire with the patience of a man who had once been told he wasn't good enough to face a customer. He standardized everything. The same goods, the same red storefronts, the same fixed prices, town after town. He bought in colossal volume, squeezing suppliers until he could sell for pennies and still profit on the ocean of sales. By the early 20th century, there were hundreds of Woolworth stores. By 1912, the Great Consolidation created the F.W. Woolworth Company, a coast-to-coast chain of over 1,000 stores. And then, in 1913, Frank Woolworth did the thing that announced to the world exactly who he had become. He built the Woolworth Building in Lower Manhattan. At 792 feet, the tallest building on Earth, a Gothic skyscraper so ornate it was nicknamed the Cathedral of Commerce. Its cost was around $13.5 million. Woolworth paid for it in cash. No mortgage, no debt. The farm boy who'd been kept out of sight in the back of a store had built the highest point in the new world and bought it outright the way another man buys a hat. President Woodrow Wilson lit the building's lights from the White House by pressing a button in Washington. Tens of thousands of bulbs blazed on at once over Manhattan. Understand what that moment meant to him. Every doubt, the employer who hid him in the back, all of it answered. In granite and electric light, in the most visible object in America. Money had made the nobody into the man who owned the sky. It seemed to prove his entire philosophy true. Money could buy anything: respect, permanence, immortality in stone. It is the most dangerous lesson a family can inherit. And Frank Woolworth was about to pass it, along with the fortune, straight down to a little girl who would believe it with her whole broken heart. Stand inside the Woolworth empire at its height, and the wonder of it is almost blinding. From a failed nickel store in Utica to over 1,000 stores from coast to coast. From a boy hidden in the back room to the man whose name was carved across the tallest building in the world. Frank Woolworth had a mansion on Fifth Avenue, an estate on Long Island, a private fortune in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even more, in today's money. Picture him in those final years, a self-made titan who filled his homes with the trappings of European aristocracy he had once only read about, who installed a great pipe organ in his mansion and had himself played to like a king. The farm boy now lived as the thing he had spent his whole life staring up at. He had purchased his way entirely out of the life he was born into. And in 1912, in the middle of that triumph, his granddaughter was born, Barbara, a baby cradled in the very heart of one of the great American fortunes, heir to the Cathedral of Commerce, born into more money than almost any child on earth. She would want for nothing. That was the promise of the Woolworth name. It was also the curse. Because a child who can have anything is about to discover the one thing that cannot be ordered, bought, or built, and spend her whole life ruined by the search for it. Look closely at the gilded nursery, and the crack is already there. The Woolworth money had bought every comfort, but it had not bought a happy family. Frank Woolworth's own home life was strained. His health and his marriage both faltered as the empire grew. And his daughter Edna, Barbara's mother, was a sensitive young woman married to a charming, frequently absent stockbroker named Franklin Hutton, a man more devoted to nightlife and other women than to his wife. Here is the detail that already contains the whole collapse. Into all that wealth, a daughter had been born. And she was, almost from the start, lonely. The fortune that could buy a building taller than any on earth could not buy her mother a faithful husband, or buy a small girl an hour of unhurried love. The Woolworth machine produced everything except warmth. The richest baby in America was about to become one of its loneliest children, and the first proof of it would arrive before she was old enough to read. Frank Woolworth died in 1919, and the fortune passed down, a third of his vast estate flowing in time toward a single little girl. By the standards of the world, Barbara Hutton had just been handed a perfect life, more money than she could ever spend, a name that opened every door on earth. But 2 years before the founder died, when Barbara was only 4 years old, something happened in a suite at the Plaza's Hotel that would shape every day of her life that followed, and that she would carry, in silence, to her own grave. To understand the woman, we have to walk into that room. For the first few years of Barbara's life, the surface of things was pure gold. She was a Woolworth and a Hutton, two fortunes braided into one's small child. There were nurses and nannies, the grandest hotels, an apartment world of velvet and silver. Her grandfather's empire was still expanding. Her father moved in the highest circles of New York finance. To anyone reading the society pages, that the little girl had been born onto the sunlit summit of American life. And this is exactly where these stories lull you to sleep. The christening gowns, the plaza suites. The sense that a child this rich must by definition be safe. We look at the money and we assume the love came with it. But behind the suite doors, Barbara's mother, Edna, was suffering. Her marriage to Franklin Hutton was, by every account, a quiet catastrophe. His affairs were an open secret, his absences constant. Edna, the heiress's daughter, had everything a woman could want except the one thing she had married for. She was wealthy, beautiful, and profoundly alone in her own marriage. The fortune kept the lights on, and the staff paid, and the world impressed. It could do nothing at all about the silence in the rooms where the family actually lived. Barbara was 4 years old. Old enough to sense unhappiness. Too young to understand it. Too young, certainly, to survive what was coming without being marked by it for the rest of her life. Because in May of 1917, in a suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York, the false calm shattered. In the worst way a calm can shatter for a small child. It was May 1917. Edna Woolworth Hutton was 33 years old. She was found dead in her suite at the Plaza Hotel. The official cause was given as an ear infection, chronic mastoiditis. That is what the family said. That is what the papers, handled carefully, mostly printed. But from the very beginning, those close to the family believed something else. That Edna, crushed by a faithless marriage and a private despair, had taken her own life. The Woolworth name was powerful enough to soften a headline. It was not powerful enough to change what had happened in that room. And here is the detail that defines Barbara Hutton's entire existence. The wound beneath all 7 marriages and every squandered dollar. It was Barbara, 4 years old, who is said to have found her mother's body. Sit with that for one moment, because everything else in this story flows from it. A 4-year-old girl, heir to one of the world's great fortunes, walking into a quiet hotel suite and finding her mother dead on the floor. No amount of Woolworth money could shield her from that single image. It would live behind her eyes for 62 more years. What happened next made it worse. Her father, Franklin Hutton, the absent, charming stockbroker, did not draw the grieving child close. He largely handed her off. Barbara was passed among relatives, nannies and boarding situations. Shuttled between her Woolworth grandfather's world and a rotating cast of caretakers, raised by staff and schools rather than by a parent who held her. Her father remarried. The little girl with all the money in the world became, in the ways that matter, an orphan with a trust fund. And watch the founder's lesson land on her in the cruelest possible form. Frank Woolworth had taught the family that money buys everything. So the adults around Barbara did what the Woolworth philosophy trained them to do. They gave her things, money, jewels, the finest of everything. They paid for her care instead of providing it. They substituted the fortune for the love. Because in this family, that substitution was the founding belief. A grieving 4-year-old did not need a tiara. She needed someone to hold her. The Woolworth machine could only offer the tiara. So Barbara grew up rich beyond imagining and starved in the one way that scars a person permanently. She learned, before she could even articulate it, the precise lesson that would destroy her. That she was valued for her fortune. And that love was something that came attached to money, or did not come at all. The first crack had opened, and it had opened in a child too young to do anything but absorb it. The first casualty of the Woolworth fortune was Edna, herself. And to understand Barbara, we have to grieve her mother properly. Because Barbara never got the chance to. Edna Woolworth had been the founder's daughter, raised inside the empire, handed the Woolworth name and the Woolworth wealth, married into the prominent Hutton family in what looked, on paper, like a perfect union of money and standing. She had everything the world counts. And it was not enough to keep her alive to 34. Here is the tragedy in its full shape. Edna was the first Woolworth to discover what the family fortune could not do. It could not make her husband love her. It could not fill the silence of a marriage built for the society pages. It could not reach the loneliness that finally consumed her in a hotel suite in 1917. The richest girl's mother died of something money has never been able to cure, and the cruelty did not stop with her death. It passed, whole and intact, into her daughter. This is the inheritance that actually matters in this family. Not the dollars, the wound. Edna died of a loneliness that wealth couldn't fill. Barbara, finding her, inherited that exact loneliness before she was 5 years old, and would spend the next 6 decades, and the entire fortune, trying to fill it the only way her family had ever taught her, by purchasing closeness. Buying husbands, buying friends, buying the feeling of being wanted, over and over until the money ran out. The mother sought love and, failing to find it, died. The daughter sought love and, failing to find it, spent everything she had chasing it across the planet. Same wound, 2 generations, different ways of dying. What is the use of inheriting a third of an empire if the first thing you truly inherit is your mother's despair? Not the heiress's own death, not yet, but the first tragedy that set everything in motion. A mother dead at 33, a 4-year-old who found her, and a fortune that rushed in to fill the gap with objects, because no one in the Woolworth world knew how to fill it with anything else. Barbara Hutton would grow into a dazzling young woman, clever, poetic, achingly generous, genuinely kind by every account. She wrote poetry. She longed, openly and all her life, simply to be loved for herself. But she had been taught, in the worst classroom imaginable, that herself was not the valuable thing. Her fortune was. And the whole world was about to confirm that lesson, in the most public way possible, on the night she turned 18. In December 1930, Barbara Hutton came of age, and her family threw her a debutante ball so lavish it became a national scandal. The timing could not have been worse. The country was sinking into the Great Depression. Breadlines, shuttered banks, families ruined. And into that misery, the Hutton fortune poured a reported sum in the tens of thousands of dollars on a single party for one 18-year-old girl. Orchestras, a transformed ballroom, the cream of society. The press and a suffering public were appalled. It was here that a newspaper columnist pinned on her the phrase that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The poor little rich girl. The public saw a spoiled heiress flaunting obscene wealth while the nation starved. They saw the jewels, the gowns, the party. They mocked her, resented her, devoured every detail. What no one saw was the truth behind the phrase. Poor little rich girl was meant as sarcasm. It was, as in fact, the most accurate description of her anyone would ever write. Behind the diamonds was the 4-year-old from the Plaza Suite. Motherless, raised by staff, certain that she was loved only for her money, and now publicly hated for the very fortune that was the source of all her loneliness. The world had decided who Barbara Hutton was, and it had decided to despise the loneliest rich girl in America. She responded the only way she knew how. She went looking for love, and she was willing to pay any price for it. Within 3 years, Barbara Hutton would stand at the altar with a self-styled Georgian prince, the first of 7 husbands. The world would call it a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a 40-year pattern in which the richest girl in the world would, again and again, buy herself a husband, and be robbed, betrayed, and abandoned by nearly everyone. In 1933, at the age of 20, Barbara Hutton married for the first time. The groom was Prince Alexis Medivani, a charming, glamorous, self-styled Georgian prince whose royal title was, like his brother's, largely a beautiful invention. The Medivanis were so famous for marrying wealthy women that society had a name for them, the marrying Mindivanis. Watch the wound from the Plaza Suite go to work, right here in the first marriage. Barbara did not choose a steady man who loved her quietly. She chose a title, a fantasy, a man who made her feel like the heroine of a fairy tale, because the 4-year-old inside her did not believe she was lovable on her own. She believed love had to be dazzling, purchased, performed. And men who marry fortunes know exactly how to perform it. Before the wedding, her father, the same Franklin Hutton who had handed her off as a grieving child, did the one practical thing the Woolworth philosophy understood. He arranged money. A large settlement reportedly flowed to Mendivani around the marriage. And Barbara's fortune began, for the first time, to be siphoned outward into the hands of a husband. The marriage lasted barely 2 years. Medivani was unfaithful, dismissive and cruel about her appearance. He reportedly told her she was too heavy, a comment that helped trigger the eating disorders and crash dieting that would wreck her health for the rest of her life. She emerged from her first marriage thinner, sadder, poorer, and more convinced than ever that she had to buy devotion. The divorce came in 1935, and almost immediately the pattern repeated. Her second husband, that same year, was Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow, a Danish nobleman with a real title, and, it emerged, a controlling and abusive temperament. This marriage gave Barbara the one genuinely good thing to come out of any of them. In 1936, her only child, a son, Lance. But the marriage itself curdled fast. Reventlow was domineering and, by Barbara's account, frightening. He maneuvered around her fortune. The relationship collapsed into a bitter, frightening separation, and by 1941 it was over. Husband number 2, gone, another piece of the fortune and the spirit chipped away. And here, in the middle of the wreckage, came the great exception, the husband who proves the entire tragedy. In 1942, Barbara married the film star Cary Grant. The papers, predictably, mocked the union with a cruel nickname, Cash and Cary. They assumed he was after her money like all the others. He wasn't. Cary Grant is the one husband on the entire list who reportedly took nothing from her, no settlement, no looting of the fortune. He was, by most accounts, genuinely fond of her and troubled by her unhappiness. For a few years, Barbara Hutton was married to a man who did not want her money, and she could not believe it. This is the most heartbreaking turn in the whole story. Given, at last, a man who wanted her and not her fortune, Barbara could not trust it. Because the 4-year-old from the plaza had been taught that love and money were the same transaction, and a love with no price tag did not compute. The marriage to Grant ended in 1945, amicably, sadly. The one husband who might have saved her was the one she was least equipped to keep. 3 marriages in, the fortune leaking with each one, the pattern now fixed and unbreakable. Find a man, buy the fairy tale, be betrayed or unable to believe it, dissolve the marriage, lose another fortune-sized piece of the inheritance, and start again, lonelier than before. She had 4 more husbands to go. While Barbara cycled through husbands, a small boy was watching it all, her son, Lance Reventlow. And here the family curse does the thing it always does. It reaches for the next generation. Barbara, who had been raised by staff and shuttled between caretakers after her mother's death, now raised her own son in almost exactly the same way, surrounded by wealth, nannies, and famous stepfathers who came and went, but short on the steady, present parenting she herself had never received. She loved Lance fiercely and lavished money and gifts on him. She struggled, just as the adults in her own childhood had, to simply be there. She was repeating, without meaning to, the precise pattern that had broken her. The Woolworth lesson, substitute the fortune for the presence, passed cleanly into a 3rd generation. But Lance did something his mother never could. He tried to escape the name. Where Barbara spent her life buying husbands and jewels, Lance turned away from the heiress world entirely and towards something he could build with his own hands and skill. Speed. He became a serious racing driver and a constructor of his own racing cars. The Scarab, an American-built race car that was genuinely his own achievement, not a Woolworth handout. He married a Hollywood actress. He went looking, in engines and racetracks, for a sense of self that money had never given his mother. For a while, it looked like the boy might break the cycle. Might be the Woolworth heir who found something real to be, beyond the fortune. Hold on to Lance. Remember that he tried. Because the family curse is not finished with him. And what eventually happens to this young man, the one Woolworth descendant who tried to earn his own identity, is the cruelest proof of all that money cannot buy safety, cannot buy time, and cannot protect the people we love from the world. For now, he is alive, fast and free. His mother, meanwhile, is moving toward the marriage that would become the single most infamous transaction of her entire life. In 1953, Barbara Hutton married her 5th husband, and it became the most notorious of them all. His name was Porfirio Rubirosa. He was a Dominican playboy and diplomat, one of the most famous womanizers of the 20th century, a man whose entire profession, more or less, was the seduction of wealthy women. Barbara was infatuated. Everyone around her could see exactly what he was. She married him anyway. The marriage lasted 53 days. 53 days. And in that time, by widely reported accounts, Rubirosa walked away enriched by a fortune in cash, property, and gifts. A settlement, a plane, racehorses, more. He took what he could and he was gone before the wedding flowers had wilted. It was the purest, fastest, most naked version of the transaction Barbara's whole life had become. Love purchased, love looted, love over in under 2 months. So, who betrayed Barbara Hutton? It is tempting to say Rubirosa, or Medivani, or any of the fortune hunters who fleeced her. And they did. But look deeper, because the real betrayal is older than all of them. Barbara was betrayed first by a belief, the founder's belief, planted in her before she could even resist it, that everything, including love, can be bought, and that a person without their fortune is nobody worth loving. Every fortune-hunting husband was simply a man who agreed with the lesson Frank Woolworth's world had already taught her. They didn't introduce the lie. They confirmed it. The deepest betrayal in Barbara's life was not any single husband. It was that no one, from the moment her mother died on that hotel floor, ever managed to convince her that she was worth loving for herself. The men who married her for money were not the cause of her tragedy. They were the evidence of it. She kept hiring them unconsciously to prove the thing she most feared was true. And it was working. Each marriage confirmed the verdict. Each divorce shaved another vast slice off the inheritance. Settlements, gifts, looted accounts, the staggering upkeep of palaces and jewels, and an army of hangers-on. The fortune that could have lasted 10 lifetimes was being handed out, piece by piece, to men who saw her coming. 2 more husbands would follow. The tennis champion Baron Gottfried von Cramm, and finally Laotian Prince Pierre Raymondon in 1964. 7 marriages in all, 6 divorces. One after another, the same machine. Hope, purchase, betrayal, loss. How many husbands does it take to fill the hole left by a mother who died when you were 4? Barbara Hutton tried 7. The answer, she learned too late, was none. That hole could never be filled by a wedding. It could only be filled by the thing she'd never had and could not buy. This is the betrayal at the heart of it all. A woman so starved for love that she spent the largest girlhood fortune in America purchasing counterfeit versions of it, again and again, because the real thing had been taken from her before she could remember its face. The marriages were the symptom. The looting of the fortune was the symptom. The disease was a 4-year-old in a quiet suite at the plaza. And Fafa to answer the grief with a checkbook. Now came the part where the checkbook finally ran dry. A fortune does not vanish all at once. It bleeds. Barbara Hutton's inheritance, worth, by many estimates, somewhere around $50 million at its height in the early decades, well over $1 billion in today's money. Drained away across 40 years through 100 open wounds at once. Tally the channels of loss. 7 marriages. 6 of them ending in settlements and gifts to departing husbands. A lifetime of palaces, a mansion in London, a celebrated palace in Tangier, homes in Mexico, suites kept indefinitely in the world's grandest hotels. An emperor's worth of jewelry, including jade and historic pieces, and a tiara once owned by Russian royalty. And around her always a swarm of staff, advisors, gigolos and hangers-on, each one drawing on the account, each one calling it friendship. Barbara gave money away as compulsively as she spent it. Genuinely, achingly generous, she showered cash and jewels on friends, lovers, strangers, anyone who showed her warmth. Still trying, to the very end, to purchase the affection she had been taught was the only kind available to her. And here is the engine of the devastation, running in plain sight. Barbara never spent money like a person who had earned it, because she never had. She spent it like a wound spends, frantically, to stop a pain that money could not actually touch. Every purchase was an attempt to feel better. Every gift was an attempt to be loved. The fortune wasn't being enjoyed. It was being bled out against a grief that had no bottom. Her health collapsed alongside her finances. The crash dieting that began with Madivani's cruelty hardened into lifelong eating disorders. She became dangerously thin, frail, dependent on pills and alcohol, in and out of crises. The richest girl in the world was, by her later years, a gaunt, fragile woman who often could not keep food down and could not bear to be alone. Look at the 2 ledgers side by side. On one, the Woolworth fortune. An empire of nickels and dimes, a building paid for in cash, a sum meant to secure 10 generations. On the other, what it actually purchased for the woman who inherited it. 7 failed marriages, a ruined body, a lifetime of being hunted for her money, and a loneliness so complete that she paid people to keep her company. The greatest 5-and-dime fortune in America bought its heiress almost nothing she truly needed. By the 1960s and into the 1970s, the unthinkable was happening. Barbara Hutton was running out of money. The settlements and the spending and the looting and the upkeep had done what no one thought possible. They had drained one of the great American fortunes down toward nothing. Advisors and hangers-on had helped themselves for decades. The principle that should have been untouchable had been touched and touched and touched again. This is the devastation the whole story has been building toward, and it is not really about the money. The money was always just the visible measure of the invisible loss. Barbara Hutton spent 40 years and $1 billion conducting a single doomed experiment. She tried to prove her grandfather right. She tried to buy love. And the final accounting, 7 husbands gone, her body wrecked, the fortune nearly exhausted, is the experiment's result, written in full. The answer the experiment returned was the one her mother had already discovered in a suite at the plaza in 1917 and died of. Money cannot buy it. It never could. The fortune that took Frank Woolworth a lifetime of nickels and dimes to build, his granddaughter had very nearly spent to zero. Not on foolishness, exactly, but on the single most human and most impossible purchase there is. And it brings us back, at last, to what the founder believed. The conviction he lived by. The lesson he passed down with the money, never knowing it was the most dangerous thing in the entire inheritance. At the very beginning, I told you Frank Woolworth lived by a single conviction about money, and that his granddaughter would test it against the human heart and lose. It is time to name it plainly. Frank Woolworth believed that money could buy anything. He had lived the proof. A shy, slighted farm boy, told he wasn't presentable enough to face a customer, had used money to buy his way to the top of the world. Respect, status, a mansion full of borrowed aristocracy, the tallest building on earth, paid in cash. To Frank Woolworth, the evidence of his own life was overwhelming and unmistakable. There was no door that enough money could not open. That was the seed. That was the darkest secret of the house of Woolworth. Not a crime, not a scandal, but a belief. A founder so wounded by poverty and rejection that he concluded money was the answer to every form of human pain, and built a family on that conviction. When his daughter Edna was dying of loneliness, the family offered her wealth and status. When his great-granddaughter Barbara was orphaned by grief at 4, the family offered her jewels and trust funds. The Woolworth answer to every wound was always the same. Buy something. And it works. For goods. For buildings. For everything that has a price. It does not work for the only things that actually matter. And Barbara Hutton was the proof Frank Woolworth never lived to see. The family member who took his core belief, the one he'd staked his entire life on, and ran it all the way to its terrible conclusion. She tried to buy love 7 times. She tried to buy belonging with palaces and generosity and jewels. She spent the whole fortune on the experiment. The founder thought money could buy anything. His granddaughter spent $1 billion and her entire life proving the one exception. The exception that happened to be the only thing she ever truly wanted. She validated his whole philosophy about the world and disproved it about the heart, simultaneously with her own ruined life. Frank Woolworth built an empire on the certainty that wealth was the answer. Barbara Hutton was the question that empire could never answer. What do you do when the one thing you need is the one thing your money cannot buy? She was, by the mid-1970s, nearly out of money and entirely out of husbands. Frail, alone, fading. And then the family curse came back for the one person she had left. Her son. By the early 1970s, Barbara Hutton had almost nothing left of what the world had once envied. The fortune was nearly gone. The husbands were gone. Her health was a ruin of failed dieting, pills and frailty. But she still had one thing, the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her, rather than to her money. She had her son, Lance, and Lance, alone among everyone who had ever orbited the Woolworth fortune, had built a life that was genuinely his own. He had walked away from the heiress world. He had become a respected racing driver and car builder, a man known for his own skill and nerve rather than his mother's name. He had found, in speed and engineering, the identity money had never been able to give Barbara. He was the proof that the curse could be broken, that a Woolworth could become a person instead of a fortune. He was the one good thing she had made, the one investment that had paid back something real. On July 24, 1972, Lance Reventlow boarded a small private plane in Colorado. He was 36 years old. The aircraft, flown by another pilot, crashed into a mountainside in bad weather. Everyone aboard was killed. The boy had tried to escape the family by mastering machines was killed. By one, not on a racetrack he commanded, but as a pantspass in a sky he could not control. And with that crash, the last thing Barbara Hutton had in the world was taken from her. Barbara never recovered from Lance's death. There was nothing left in her to recover with. Consider the symmetry of the two deaths that bracketed her life. It began with a death she could not understand, her mother, on a hotel room floor, when Barbara was 4. It effectively ended with a death she could not survive, her son on a mountainside, when she was 60. The richest girl in the world entered life by losing the person she needed most, and left it the same way. The fortune that filled every year in between had been powerless at both ends. Her final years were a slow disappearance. She retreated, more and more, into hotel suites, the same kind of room her mother had died in, the same kind of room she herself had been raised in. She kept a dwindling court of paid companions and hangers-on around her, still buying company because she had never learned any other way to keep people close. She was often bedridden, weighing under 80 pounds, unable to walk unaided, dependent on others for everything. And here is the detail that captures the entire tragedy of inherited wealth in a single image. As the money finally ran out, the crowd ran out with it. The friends who had feasted on the Woolworth fortune for decades melted away as the account emptied, proving in her last and loneliest years the exact thing Barbara had feared since she was 4. That she had been loved for her money, and that when the money was gone, so was the love. She had spent her whole life trying to disprove that fear. Her final years confirmed it. The Tangier Palace, the London mansion, the jewels, the Romanov tiara, sold, given away, or gone. The empire of nickels and dimes had been spent down to its last threads. By the time Barbara Hutton reached her final months, the woman who had inherited the equivalent of more than $1 billion was living on the financial fumes of it. Her remaining assets reportedly reduced to a few $1,000s. The fortune that took Frank Woolworth a lifetime to build had, in the hands of his granddaughter, very nearly returned to the nothing he had started from. She had come full circle, all the way back to the poverty her grandfather had spent his life escaping. On May 11, 1979, in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles, Barbara Hutton died of a heart attack. She was 66 years old, though by then she looked far older. A tiny, frail figure who had outlived her mother, her son, 6 of her 7 marriages, and almost her entire fortune. When her estate was settled, the accounting was almost beyond belief. Barbara Woolworth Hutton, heir to one of the great American fortunes, a woman who had owned palaces on 3 continents and the jewels of dead empresses, died with reportedly around $3,500 to her name. $3,500. From over $1 billion. And now the cruelest truth of that newspaper phrase comes fully due. At 18, the world had mocked her as the poor little rich girl, a sarcastic jab at a spoiled heiress flaunting wealth in the depths of the Depression. But the phrase had never been sarcasm. It had been prophecy. She died exactly that, poor and little and once rich. The label the pinned on her as a joke turned out to be the most honest thing anyone ever said about her. She had been a poor little rich girl from the moment she found her mother's body, and she remained one until the moment her own heart stopped. She was, by every account of those who knew her past the headlines, a kind, intelligent, generous, poetic woman, someone who wrote verse, who gave compulsively, who wanted nothing more than to be loved for herself. That woman existed the whole time, underneath the scandal and the jewels. The world simply never bought it, because the world had been taught, by her own family, to see only the fortune. She died as she had lived since the age of 4, surrounded by the trappings of wealth, and essentially alone. Lay the whole dynasty out, end to end, and look at what one wounded man's belief actually produced. Frank Woolworth, the founder, died in 1919. A farm boy who had conquered poverty so completely that he raised the tallest building on earth and paid for it in cash, certain to the end that money was the answer to every human need. His daughter Edna died in 1917, at 33, in a hotel suite, wealthy, beautiful, and so alone in her marriage that the loneliness is widely believed to have killed her. The first Woolworth to discover what the fortune could not buy. His great-granddaughter Barbara found that body at 4 years old, inherited the wound along with the money, and spent 40 years and over $1 billion trying to purchase the love her family had taught her she could only ever rent. 7 husbands, 6 divorces, a wrecked body, and Lance, the one heir who tried to escape, who built something real with his own hands, died on a mountainside at 36, before his mother, leaving her with nothing at all. One cause sits beneath all of it. Not bad luck. Not gold-digging husbands, though there were many. The cause was a founder who looked at his own painful life, concluded that money was the cure for every wound, and bred that single belief so deep into his family that not one of them ever learned the truth in time. That the things which actually keep a person alive, being loved, being wanted for yourself, being held in grief, have never had a price, and never will. The Woolworths had a fortune that could buy the sky over Manhattan. It could not buy Edna a reason to live, or Barbara an hour of being loved for herself, or Lance a few more years on the ground. How does $1 billion fortune end with its heiress dead in a hotel room with $3,000 and no one beside her? The same way it always ends in every one of these families. Handed to a child as a substitute for love by people who genuinely believe the substitution would work. It never works. Barbara Hutton's entire life was the proof. Be careful with the lesson, because it would be easy to take the wrong one. The lesson is not that money is evil, or that wealth must curse whoever holds it. Frank Woolworth's nickels and dimes gave millions of ordinary people goods they could finally afford. Money, used well, builds and feeds and frees. The villain was never the fortune. The villain was the substitution, the quiet, generational habit of handing a person money in the place where love was supposed to go. When Edna was lonely, the family gave her status. When Barbara was orphaned by grief, the family gave her jewels. When Barbara raised Lance, she gave him gifts where she could not give presents. 3 generations, 1 reflex. Pay instead of show up. What none of them understood, what cost them everything to learn, is that a child does not need a tiara. A child needs to be held. And no fortune ever assembled can perform that one simple, unpurchasable act. And this is where the Woolworths stops being a story and become a mirror. Because the substitution Frank Woolworth made is the same one tempting every parent who ever worked late to provide. The belief that the things we buy our children can stand in for the time we give them. That if we just secure them enough, they'll be safe. Barbara Hutton is the proof of where that ends. She was given the most money a girl could be given, and almost none of the things she actually needed. And she spent $1 billion across a wrecked and beautiful life trying to buy it back. The fortune was never the inheritance that mattered. The wound was. And the wound is the one thing money cannot heal, only pass down. There is a boy, somewhere in your memory of this story, kept in the back of a store because he wasn't presentable enough to be seen. A farm boy who decided that money would make him somebody, and who proved it so completely that he bought the tallest building on earth. He got everything he wanted, and the fortune he built to defeat his own loneliness was handed down to a 4-year-old girl, who used it to chase love across the entire world, and died in a hotel suite with $3,000 and a telephone that did not ring. That silent phone is the whole story. Not the skyscraper, not the jewels, not the 7 weddings. A woman who could afford to call anyone on earth, and had no one left who would come. Barbara Hutton was the Woolworth heiress, who married 7 times and died penniless. But she was never really poor in the way the world laughed at. She was poor in the only way that has ever mattered, and no amount of money was ever going to make her rich.